For nearly 1,000 years, the Tower of London has stood as one of the most infamous places of imprisonment and death in British history. Its thick stone walls have witnessed the falls of queens, nobles, spies, traitors, and rebels, all brought to an end in the shadow of the crown. But what did it actually mean to be executed at the Tower of London? How did this process unfold, from the condemned's final night in the fortress to the moment the axe fell or the gun fired? This video explores in detail how executions at the Tower of London really worked, separating myth from reality, and tracing the steps of those who met their fate within its walls. Contrary to popular belief, not every prisoner of the Tower of London was executed there. In fact, most prisoners held within its walls, especially during the Tudor and Stuart eras, were either released, ransomed, or executed elsewhere, usually at Tower Hill, a raised hill and platform just outside the fortress walls. The tower itself was used for private or state executions, those deemed too politically sensitive or scandalous to be carried out before the public. These were typically reserved for nobles, royals, and high-ranking traitors. The aim was not secrecy, but control. By keeping the execution inside the tower, the crown could avoid turning the condemned into a martyr or public spectacle. Over the centuries, only a small number of people were actually executed within the tower's precinct, around 10 in total. These included some of the most famous victims in English history: Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, Lady Jane Grey, and Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. Each of these deaths followed a carefully planned ritualised process. Once condemned, a prisoner in the tower would be moved from their cell, often in the lieutenant's lodgings, now the King's House, to more secure quarters closer to the site of execution. The constable of the tower and the lieutenant had the grim duty of overseeing the prisoners' confinement, ensuring they were guarded but treated according to their rank. In many cases, a condemned prisoner was allowed certain privileges: visits from family or clergy, wine or food of their choice, and time for prayer. Nobility and royals were treated with relative dignity. Execution was seen not merely as punishment, but as a necessary act of political theatre. For example, Anne Boleyn spent her final days in the Queen's lodgings within the tower, attended by her ladies-in-waiting and visited by Archbishop Cranmer. She was even informed that her execution would be carried out with a sword rather than an axe, a final courtesy granted by her husband Henry VIII, who believed the sword would offer a cleaner death. For executions inside the tower, a scaffold would be built upon the green, known now as Tower Green. The structure was temporary, made of timber and draped in black cloth. It was smaller and more intimate than the grand stage used at Tower Hill, where crowds reached their thousands. Tower Green executions were conducted in the presence of only a few witnesses, usually officials of the crown, guards, a priest, and select members of the household or family. The public were not allowed to attend. The executioner, often a professional brought in from outside, was paid handsomely for his work, and was expected to carry it out with precision and dignity. The condemned were often allowed to choose their clothing for the occasion. Many wore black or fine linen, symbolic of both mourning and honour. Anne Boleyn, for instance, dressed in a grey damask gown trimmed with fur, and Catherine Howard reportedly appeared in white, the colour of innocence. On the appointed morning, the condemned was awoken early. A priest would administer final prayers and the sacrament. The prisoner was then escorted, often on foot, from their lodgings to Tower Green. The short walk, sometimes across the cobbled courtyard, was silent except for the shuffle of guards and the ringing of the chapel bell. Those who faced execution were expected to show courage and grace. Displays of hysteria or defiance were frowned upon. A composed death was seen as a final act of nobility, a demonstration of loyalty to God, if not the crown. At the scaffold, the prisoner was usually offered a brief speech. This was a critical moment. The condemned was expected to forgive their executioner, praise the king or queen, and ask the crowd, however small, to pray for their soul. Words of protest or treason were dangerous. Even now, the authorities wanted no martyrdom, no last-minute rebellion of words. The vast majority of tower executions were by beheading, a method considered honourable compared to hanging, drawing and quartering. The axe, or in Anne Boleyn's case a sword, symbolised a death fit for nobles. The executioner's block was placed at the centre of the scaffold, draped in black. The condemned knelt, placed their head upon the block, and sometimes blindfolded themselves or were helped by an attendant. A bag of straw was often laid nearby to absorb the blood. The executioner would then take position, sometimes asking forgiveness from the prisoner for the act he was about to commit. When all was ready, he raised his weapon high and delivered the fatal blow, ideally in one clean stroke. Not all executions, though, went smoothly. The execution of Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, in 1541 became infamous when the inexperienced headsman struck her multiple times as she attempted to flee across the scaffold. But others, such as Anne Boleyn's, were carried out with swift and practised precision. After the beheading, the executioner would lift the severed head and cry, "God save the King or Queen," a ritual affirmation of royal authority. The body was then covered up and removed for burial. Those executed on Tower Green were usually interred within the Tower's chapel, St. Peter ad Vincula, the chapel of St. Peter in chains. Beneath its flagstone floor lie the remains of many of England's most tragic figures: Anne Boleyn, allegedly Catherine Howard, Lady Jane Grey, and Thomas More among them. The burials were often carried out quietly and without ceremony. Bodies were placed in simple wooden coffins and lowered beneath the chapel floor. Only centuries later, during restoration work in the 19th century, were many of these graves rediscovered and re-identified by archaeologists. For most Tower prisoners, including nobles like Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell and the Duke of Monmouth, execution took place outside the Tower on Tower Hill. There, a large scaffold was erected before crowds that could number the thousands. These public executions were intended to serve as both punishment and spectacle, a warning to others not to commit treason. The process was similar to those inside the Tower, but far grander. The condemned might arrive by cart, escorted by guards, to the sound of church bells and murmuring crowds. Even on Tower Hill, the ritual of speech, prayer, forgiveness and execution followed the same pattern. Heads were sometimes displayed afterwards on London Bridge, grim trophies of royal justice. By the 18th century, executions at the Tower had largely ceased. The last beheading on Tower Hill took place in 1747, that of Simon Fraser, Lord Lovat, for his role in the Jacobite Rising. However, the Tower's role as a place of execution briefly returned during the 20th century. During both World Wars, several spies were executed by firing squad within its walls. The final execution at the Tower took place in 1941, when German spy Josef Jacobs was shot by a military firing squad in the Tower's miniature rifle range. The Tower of London remains a symbol of both majesty and mortality, a place where power and death intertwined. Executions within its walls were not chaotic or cruel, but choreographed displays of royal authority, intended to end lives quietly, but make political statements loudly. From Anne Boleyn's calm farewell to the world, to the crack of gunfire that ended Josef Jacobs' life centuries later, each Tower execution followed a ritual steeped in ceremony, symbolism and fear, reminders that even in England's mightiest fortress, no one was above the crown. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.